Defeating Ukraine? Not possible. The words landed with the weight of a thunderclap. General Jack Keane, a four-star commander who had seen war from the inside out, delivered them live on air, his tone steady, his conviction absolute. The camera cut from his face to the brutal realities of the battlefield. Tanks, scarred and smoking, littered the frozen earth. Apartment blocks crumbled into dust under missile strikes. Blackened streets whispered of lives upended. And yet, woven between the wreckage, the world saw another story. Blue and yellow flags rising defiantly from balconies. Children draped in colors of hope. Soldiers, exhausted but unbroken, lifting each other to their feet. The contrast was unbearable and magnetic. Could both be true? Could a nation so battered still be, in Keane's words, impossible to defeat? Across studios and social feeds, anchors blinked, audiences gasped, analysts leaned forward in disbelief. This wasn't the kind of polished optimism of a press release. It was the blunt assessment of a veteran who had spent decades decoding the logic of war. And if he was right, then the world's understanding of this conflict had just shifted. Because the narrative so far had been dominated by scale. Russia's arsenal, Russia's manpower, Russia's reach. The image of David had been framed in the shadow of an overwhelming Goliath. But Keane wasn't talking about size. He was pointing to something deeper, something harder to measure, harder to bomb, harder to break. And that left one burning question hanging in the air. What exactly made Ukraine undefeatable? The pause that followed was electric. Social media clipped the soundbite. Newsrooms scrambled to rewrite their headlines, and millions leaned closer to their screens. And then, with a calmness only a general could carry, Keane explained the reason. Cliffhanger. And what Keane revealed next shook the entire narrative of the war. Keane's words lingered in the air like a challenge. Defeating Ukraine? Not possible. On their surface, they sounded bold, even reckless. But the more you pulled at them, the more they carried the weight of a prophecy. This wasn't a general brushing off the headlines of the day. This was a decorated commander, a strategist who had seen America's longest wars up close, declaring something that turned the world's assumptions on their head. Because, to many, the math seemed cruelly simple. Russia was the Goliath. More tanks, more missiles, more troops, more reach. Ukraine, by comparison, looked like a country cornered, exhausted, bleeding. But Keane wasn't talking about math. He was talking about something far harder to quantify. Resolve. Identity. The kind of spirit that doesn't bend even when logic says it should. And that's why this statement mattered. Because what Keane was really saying is that wars are not always decided by firepower, but by willpower. And in that equation, Ukraine had something Russia never understood. The fight for land was only part of it. The fight for dignity, freedom, and survival, that was where the true battle raged. Millions around the world tuned into the broadcast, some nodding, others scoffing, but few looking away. The remark ignited a debate across continents. Could it really be true that a smaller, war-torn nation could not just resist, but deny defeat against one of the world's most formidable military machines? For Ukrainians, the statement was a kind of validation. They weren't crazy to keep fighting. They weren't delusional to believe that their sacrifices meant something larger than square kilometers on a map. And for Russia's leadership, those words carried the sting of defiance, proof that the war they promised would be over in days had become the very quagmire they feared most. But here's where the stakes grew even sharper. Because Keane wasn't offering comfort, he was issuing a warning. If Ukraine could not be defeated, then the war itself was shifting into something far more dangerous, a prolonged contest that would test not only soldiers, but entire societies, economies, alliances, democracies. What started as Russia versus Ukraine was, in Keane's eyes, now about whether the free world itself had the stamina to match Ukraine's determination. And that's why his words echoed so loudly. This wasn't just about trenches or front lines. It was about the fault lines of a new era. If Ukraine's survival was inevitable, then the question wasn't whether Russia would lose. It was how far they'd go to deny that outcome. Viewers across Europe and America sat forward in their chairs, commentators scrambling to interpret the general's meaning. Was this confidence? A veiled warning? or both. And in Kyiv, where civilians huddled in subways against missile strikes, people whispered the line to one another with a kind of quiet pride. Not possible. The phrase became a shield of words, a reminder that they were not alone in believing that their story wasn't destined to end in surrender. But Keane's declaration carried another implication, one few wanted to say out loud. If defeat was impossible, then Russia might escalate in ways no one was prepared for. Nuclear hints, cyber onslaughts, political destabilization. The stakes were no longer just about who controlled territory, but whether the world was ready for the costs of Ukraine's endurance. And as the broadcast cut to break, the audience was left with a single haunting question. If Ukraine could not be defeated, what desperate move might its adversary make next? Long before the first missile struck Ukraine, the story of this war began with one man, Vladimir Putin. For 2 decades, he cultivated an image not just of a leader, but of a modern czar, unyielding, calculating, a figure who demanded fear as much as respect. His rise from a KGB officer to the Kremlin's throne was built on one principle: power belongs to those willing to wield it without hesitation. He learned early that spectacle mattered. When Russia fought in Chechnya, Putin's iron fist approach signaled to his people that he would not tolerate weakness. Cities reduced to rubble, resistance crushed, he branded himself as the man who could restore order to chaos. The world looked on, some horrified, others impressed. But inside Russia, the message was clear. Here was a leader who ruled through strength, not compromise. Over time, that became his political weapon. He draped himself in nostalgia for the Soviet Empire, appealing to citizens who longed for the days when Moscow's shadow stretched across continents. He framed every foreign policy move as Russia reclaiming its rightful place on the world stage. Georgia in 2008, Crimea in 2014, Syria in 2015. Each time, he defied the West, daring anyone to stop him. Each time, he walked away emboldened. And that arrogance grew. For years, Western leaders underestimated him, assuming economic ties or diplomacy could tame his ambitions. But Putin read their hesitation as weakness. He mocked it. He exploited it. He learned that threats worked, and when backed by force, they became undeniable. To his supporters, he wasn't just a president, he was Russia's shield against humiliation. To his critics, he was a tyrant cloaked in patriotism. But beneath the grandeur, patterns began to emerge. His victories often came against opponents too small, too fractured, or too weary to resist. In Crimea, Russian troops seized control without firing a shot, exploiting confusion and denial. In Syria, he propped up a dictator already abandoned by much of the world. To outsiders, these moves looked bold. But inside the pattern lay a truth. Putin preferred fights he was sure he could win. That mindset would shape his greatest gamble, Ukraine. He saw a young democracy struggling with corruption, vulnerable to division, yearning for Western ties. He imagined a swift operation, a quick collapse of Kyiv, and a triumphant speech, declaring Russia whole again. He envisioned parades, not resistance. He expected fear, not defiance. And that arrogance seeped into every decision. Intelligence briefings told him Ukrainian leadership would flee. Advisors assured him Western nations would hesitate, divided by politics and economics. He believed his own myth that his power was unstoppable, that history bent to his will. And so, he rolled the dice. But arrogance is a double-edged sword. What Putin miscalculated was the human spirit, the will of ordinary Ukrainians who refused to kneel. His tanks met not surrender, but defiance. His missiles sparked not silence, but global outrage. Instead of fracturing NATO, his invasion breathed new life into it. Instead of isolating Ukraine, he made it the symbol of courage for the entire democratic world. The strongman image he spent decades crafting suddenly showed cracks. His speeches, once delivered with chilling confidence, grew defensive, paranoid. His threats of nuclear fire revealed not strength, but fear of losing control. The very persona he had built, the master strategist, the invincible czar, was now being tested in ways he never imagined. And slowly, the world began to see him differently. Not as the all-powerful architect of destiny, but as a man trapped by his own hubris. Each battlefield setback, each failed offensive, chipped away at the legend. Each Ukrainian stand at Kiev, at Kharkiv, at Kherson turned the narrative from Putin's dominance to Putin's desperation. But what makes him dangerous is not simply his ambition, it is his refusal to accept defeat. Throughout his career, whenever cornered, Putin has doubled down. He has always chosen escalation over retreat, repression over concession, and that is what makes the stakes of this war so perilous. A man who has built his identity on never losing is now facing the one fight he cannot control. For years, the world asked, what would it take to stop Vladimir Putin? Now, that question has changed. What happens when a man who can? The tension in the room was palpable. One commentator smirked dismissively, suggesting Keane was blinded by emotion, by Western bias. Another accused him of giving false hope to viewers. The anchors shifted nervously, trying to balance the clash without losing control of the broadcast. But Keane didn't back down. He leaned in, his voice low but firm. You can doubt weapons. You can doubt supply chains. But don't you dare doubt the resolve of a people fighting for their survival. History is full of empires that miscalculated the human spirit. Russia is about to learn that lesson the hard way. For a moment there was nothing but silence. The studio's air seemed to thicken, as if everyone understood they had just heard something bigger than analysis. It was a warning, a prophecy, a reframing of the entire war. And beyond the studio walls, millions of viewers felt it too. Social media lit up with clips. Hashtags trended. Some mocked Keane's confidence. Others celebrated it as the clarity they had been waiting for. The audience was split, but electrified. Because this wasn't just a debate about tanks and missiles, it was about belief. About whether Ukraine was doomed to be erased or destined to rewrite history. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, the camera cut to Kyiv, where Zelensky was preparing to address the nation. The anchors looked into the lens, their voices almost hushed. We'll be going live now to President Zelensky. Stay with us. The screen faded. The world held its breath. Cliffhanger. Then Zelensky leaned in, looked straight into the camera, and the air in the studio and across the globe shifted. The screen went black for a second. Then, the image flickered back to life. President Volodymyr Zelensky, seated in his now familiar green military shirt, the insignia of resilience itself. His face carried the weariness of sleepless nights, but his eyes, sharp, unflinching, burned with a resolve that silenced even the most skeptical critics watching around the globe. The anchors fell quiet. The analysts shifted in their chairs, and millions tuned in, not knowing they were about to witness one of the most electrifying addresses of the war. Zelensky began softly, his voice calm, almost conversational. Tonight, I speak not only to Ukrainians, but to every free person in the world who still wonders whether we can endure. He paused. The room seemed to lean closer. For months, they said we would last only days. They counted our tanks. They measured our ammunition. They doubted our courage. But here we are, still standing, still fighting, still free. That line struck like thunder. Keane's earlier words, defeating Ukraine? Not possible, suddenly had flesh and blood behind them. This wasn't theory. This was lived defiance. The camera cut to images of Ukrainian soldiers in the field, battered but unbowed, waving flags atop wrecked Russian armor. Then back to Zelensky, his expression sharpening. Russia has power, but power without purpose collapses. They have weapons, but weapons without will are useless. And what they underestimated is the one thing they cannot destroy: the spirit of a nation fighting for its children's right to live free. In the studio, one of the commentators who had mocked Ukraine's chances earlier scribbled frantically in his notes, trying to reframe his argument. But the moment had already slipped beyond his control. Zelensky leaned closer to the camera, his tone shifting from reflective to surgical. He cited not just emotion, but evidence. He listed Russia's logistical failures, convoys stranded, fuel shortages, troops deserting. He referenced intercepted communications, showing demoralized Russian soldiers questioning their mission. Then he turned it into a blade. They thought Ukraine would surrender in fear. Instead, their own soldiers surrender in confusion. That is the truth they don't want you to hear. The anchors were stone-faced now. fully aware this wasn't just a speech. It was an on-air dismantling of Russia's narrative. Then Zelensky pivoted. He invoked history. Napoleon marched with power. Hitler marched with power. Both believed sheer force would crush nations, but force without justice always breaks. Always. His hand came down on the desk with a quiet but deliberate thud. And Putin will break too. The phrase echoed. Social media exploded instantly. Hashtags like Ukraine will not fall and Zelensky live, shooting to the top within minutes. Clips circulated of that single moment. Zelensky's fist hitting the desk, captions declaring, "History repeats, but this time, we are the ones writing it." But it wasn't just bravado. Zelensky then turned directly to ordinary Ukrainians watching in candlelit rooms, in bunkers, in basements. His voice softened again. "I know you are tired. I know you are afraid. I see the ruins of our cities, the tears of our children, but I also see your courage. I see you carry food to soldiers. I see you shield neighbors from bombs. I see you sing our anthem while rockets fall. That is what no army can defeat." For the studio audience, for global viewers, it was impossible not to feel the emotional weight. Even the anchor's hands trembled slightly as they shuffled their papers, caught between journalistic neutrality and human awe. And then came the pivot, the mic drop that no one expected. Zelensky looked directly into the lens, not as a president speaking to citizens, but as a man challenging the entire world. "If you think Ukraine fights only for itself, you are mistaken. We fight for every nation that values freedom over fear, for every people who has ever faced a tyrant, for every family who believes tomorrow belongs to them, not to a dictator." The power of the moment was cinematic. Analysts who had been ready to counter with talking points found themselves speechless. The broadcast no longer felt like a debate, it was a rallying cry. Then Zelensky struck the closing blow. A line destined to be replayed for years. They ask, "Can Ukraine survive against Russia?" I ask, "Can Russia survive against the truth?" Because truth is the one weapon that does not run out, does not break, and does not retreat. And tonight, truth is on our side. The studio erupted not with applause, for it wasn't that kind of setting, but with a charged silence. The kind that only follows when something undeniable has been spoken. Keane sat back in his chair, a faint smile on his face, as if to say, "This is exactly what I meant." Across the world, the ripple effect was immediate. Hashtags merged into a single chorus. Commentators who had hedged their bets suddenly shifted tone. News outlets replayed the segment on loop, some calling it the speech that rewrote the war. But more important than the media storm was the emotional resonance. Ukrainians in shelters cheered. Crowds in European capitals gathered in squares, holding up phones to replay his words. Even in Washington and London, lawmakers tweeted clips with captions like, "This is why we must stand with Ukraine." And somewhere in Moscow, as reports later hinted, even Russian officials privately admitted the broadcast had done more damage to their propaganda machine than 1,000 missiles ever could. When the feed cut back to the studio, no one knew what to say. Finally, one anchor whispered, barely above a breath, "The air has just changed. Everywhere." Cliffhanger. But Zelensky wasn't finished. His closing words carried not just a warning for Putin, but a challenge to the entire world. The moment Zelensky's speech ended, the ripple effect began almost instantly. Within seconds, clips of his desk-pounding declaration, "Can Russia survive against the truth?" were spliced, subtitled, and blasted across Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and Telegram. What had started as a live broadcast to a global news audience became a digital wildfire. The first wave of reaction came from Ukrainians themselves. In Kyiv, despite ongoing air raid sirens, videos emerged of citizens in subway shelters watching the speech on cracked phones, breaking into applause, some even singing the national anthem in unison. In Kharkiv, soldiers stationed on the front lines posted grainy footage of themselves cheering as the words replayed through a radio feed. Hashtags surged in Ukrainian, then in English. Zelensky live. Truth, tyranny. Ukraine will not fall. By dawn, the message had crossed continents. In London, a BBC anchor called it a Churchillian moment for the digital age. CNN ran with the chyron. Zelensky turns words into weapons. Even in countries historically skeptical of Ukraine's fight, newspapers ran headlines conceding the speech's force. Le Monde wrote, "A president becomes a symbol." The conservative and liberal media split, however, was telling. In the U.S., right-leaning commentators praised Zelensky's defiance, but questioned whether Western taxpayers should carry the burden forever. Fox News displayed a split screen. Zelensky speaking on one side, military aid numbers on the other. On MSNBC, anchors framed the speech as proof that Ukraine's fight was inseparable from the global defense of democracy. Still, across divides, there was one undeniable takeaway. Zelensky had shifted the tone of the war. What had long been covered as a grim stalemate was suddenly reframed as a moral contest, with Ukraine embodying resilience and Russia cast as a collapsing giant. Legal and military experts chimed in next. Former generals dissected his references to logistics, nodding gravely as they confirmed Russia's well-documented fuel shortages and desertions. International law professors praised the precision with which he invoked history, not to glorify war, but to draw parallels that made Putin's aggression look reckless and doomed. The fusion of emotional appeal and hard data struck a balance even seasoned leaders rarely achieve. Meanwhile,